¿Eso estaba pasando, Rodrigo, en todos los paneles o no está pasando solamente a nuestro panel?
Estaba pasando solamente en nuestro panel, hasta donde entiendo. Ok, Eugenio, ya estamos al aire nuevamente. Disculpen la intromisión. Por favor, podemos continuar con la presentación. Gracias.
Bueno, perfecto. Entonces, como les decía, la región está con niveles de deuda del orden del 60% del PIB ahora, mucho más que el 40% que tenía en la crisis del 2008. Y eso es importante porque vemos que los niveles iniciales de deuda condicionan mucho el tamaño de respuesta de los paquetes ante esta crisis, ¿no? Y entonces aquí pueden ver, por ejemplo, cómo países como Perú y Chile tienen poca deuda y han podido responder con paquetes muy grandes, mientras que países como Barbados o la Argentina, que tienen niveles de deuda más altos, han respondido con paquetes más pequeños. Bueno, a ver, ahora... Ok, entonces ahora lo que quiero es presentarles ante este problema que tenemos una estrategia posible. Yo la voy a presentar en términos muy generales, seguro que la vamos a poder discutir después en más detalle y ojalá les sirva como marco para toda la parte de discusión agroalimentaria que van a tener. Entonces, yo quiero que usemos una analogía de que nos imaginemos que entramos a un túnel pandémico, ¿no? Que no sabemos cuán largo es, o sea, no sabemos cuándo vamos a poder convivir con el virus o tendremos una vacuna, y no sabemos cómo va a ser el mundo a la salida, pero sí tenemos la certeza que vamos a ser más pobres, más desiguales y más endeudados, con lo cual nosotros pensamos que volver al punto de partida no es una opción y la región va a tener que encontrar maneras de crecer más. Si no, nos van a acechar los fantasmas del default, van a crecer las tensiones sociales y eso es una mala receta. Entonces, como les decía, en esta analogía, imaginemos que entramos al túnel con la pandemia, saldremos cuando encontremos la vacuna, y en ese túnel nosotros proponemos dos tipos de medidas para hacer adentro del túnel. Las primeras son las de limitación de pérdidas, que son las que están haciendo los países en este momento, no me voy a detener mucho en ellas. Yo creo que además tenemos que aprovechar todavía cuando entramos al túnel para pensar reformas que nos hagan crecer más a la salida. Si no, como les decía, vamos a tener problemas. A la salida del túnel, tendremos que remediar algunas cosas que no salieron bien, pero también continuar apoyando las reformas para crecer más. Y lo que voy a comentarles es que hay un círculo virtuoso que podemos establecer si podemos poner estos dos conjuntos de políticas andando a la entrada o adentro del túnel. Bueno, ya voy a contar más sobre esto, pero decir primero que lo más importante es atender la salud y la preservación, ¿no? Preservación tanto de firmas como de hogares y de empleos. Y también hacer mejor uso de las políticas sanitarias porque creemos que es el mejor estímulo económico, dado que si bajamos los riesgos y el miedo a la infección, entonces podremos evitar el freno que tiene la economía en este momento. En términos de preservación económica, les doy dos ejemplos que nos preocuparon fuertemente. Uno tiene que ver con una encuesta que hicimos en el banco a la mayoría de los países de la región, donde preguntamos a la gente si había perdido su empleo o no, y acá lo importante a tener en cuenta es que el quintil más pobre de la población, prácticamente el 70% perdió su empleo, contra el quintil más rico, que fue solo el 20%. Y esto ya entonces ahonda los problemas de desigualdad, con lo cual tenemos que limitar estas pérdidas de ingresos de hogares pobres e informales. Y después otro tanto con las empresas que han tenido, por ejemplo, a partir de una encuesta de Argentina de empresas privadas, donde el 72% de las firmas anunciaron caídas en las ventas mayores al 60% y están con problemas en el mercado de crédito, y aquí lo que queremos es evitar la destrucción del tejido productivo y del capital humano. Y también la preservación incluye la estabilidad fiscal. Como les decía, nosotros empezamos con niveles de deuda de entre 57 y 60%, según incluyamos a Venezuela o no, y con la caída fuerte de ingresos del orden del 26% en los últimos números que tenemos, y el aumento del paquete promedio por gastos de casi 4 puntos, eso nos podría llevar rápidamente la deuda en un par de años a entre 76 y 79% del PIB, lo cual nos habla de la importancia de preservar esta estabilidad fiscal, y que va a ser un desafío. Esto va a guiar en parte las políticas que voy a comentarles después. Además de las políticas de preservación, y acá es donde nosotros hacemos la diferencia, lo que empujamos es la idea de construir un nuevo contrato social, que sea básicamente una serie de reformas institucionales y de política pública que, por un lado, aumenten las oportunidades, al mismo tiempo mejoren la cobertura social y generen más crecimiento inclusivo a largo plazo. ¿Cuál es el círculo virtuoso que les comentaba recién? Por supuesto que en la medida que hagamos buenas políticas de preservación, vamos a conservar el capital humano e intangible que tienen las firmas, y esto va a hacer que la recuperación económica sea más rápida a la salida del túnel. Pero además, si podemos hacer anuncios creíbles dentro del túnel de políticas de crecimiento inclusivo que se van a seguir al salir, eso va a traer mayores opciones de financiamiento ahora, ¿no? O sea, un futuro mejor me abre más los mercados de crédito hoy, me da más recursos para hacer mejor la política de preservación, y ahí pueden ver el círculo virtuoso que se puede generar. Pero es muy importante que hagamos además estas políticas de crecimiento inclusivo. Y acá el gran actor para hacer todo esto es el sector público, pero le estamos exigiendo mucho al sector público porque queremos tener gobiernos ágiles, ¿no? Que tengan la capacidad, ante estas restricciones fiscales, primero de reorientar masivamente el gasto hacia el sector de salud y limitando las pérdidas dentro del túnel, pero inmediatamente, una vez que tengamos controlada la pandemia, hacer políticas de estímulo y crecimiento equitativo fuera del túnel. O sea que acá va a haber que hacer reasignaciones masivas de gasto, y no estamos acostumbrados en la región a tener esa flexibilidad en el gasto público. Por supuesto que además vamos a tener que generar espacio fiscal para las políticas pro crecimiento que les estaba proponiendo, tanto en el gasto como en la recaudación y en los procesos. Y acá, en un informe que hicimos hace un par de años en el banco sobre gasto público, identificamos ineficiencias de más de 4 puntos del PIB que podrían servir para generar este espacio fiscal. Bueno, ¿cuáles son las condiciones y opciones para el éxito de esta estrategia? Entonces, primero, como les decía, están las políticas de limitación de pérdidas. Acá no me voy a detener mucho porque es lo que ya se está haciendo, pero básicamente estamos hablando de, una vez que hayamos fortalecido el sector de salud, que ya estamos allí en la mayoría de los países, es conservar el capital intangible de los trabajadores y las firmas, evitar el abandono escolar y el cierre de escuelas, y evitar el colapso de los servicios públicos que han tenido caídas en el uso de casi el 80% en algunos casos, ¿no? Aquí yo listo una serie de medidas que no tengo tiempo para destacar ahora, pero que ustedes las pueden ver después más tarde en la presentación o en el informe. Una vez que ya la parte de preservación está encaminada, hay que pasar a la etapa de crecimiento, y dentro de las políticas pro crecimiento, nosotros creemos que hay algunas que por su naturaleza pueden generar un impulso más rápido en la recuperación, y por eso voy a insistir tanto en la inversión pública como en la inversión privada. Una característica común en las crisis financieras anteriores es que la inversión cayó en promedio un 35%, y 2 años después solo un tercio de esa brecha se cierra espontáneamente. Por eso creemos que hay que empujar mucho este tema. La inversión pública, el trabajo que hemos hecho en el banco, muestra que tiene el multiplicador más alto, ¿no? De gasto, de casi 2, o sea que por cada peso que gasto en infraestructura puedo llegar a tener hasta 2 pesos de producto, y ojalá sea esto con un énfasis en infraestructura sostenible y digital. Por otro lado, hay que fomentar la inversión privada, otra vez una serie de medidas que podemos discutir más tarde, pero creo que esto es la base para generar esa chispa de impulso al crecimiento. Y después, como les decía, tenemos que, no sé, de alguna manera refundar el contrato social con políticas para mayores oportunidades, y para esto me refiero a desarmar la trama de regulaciones y políticas tributarias que impiden la creación de empresas productivas y de empleos productivos, ¿no? Pero estas oportunidades no tienen que ir solas, sino que también tenemos que pensar en el acompañamiento con políticas sociales que además mejoren la equidad. A mí me gusta decir que aquí necesitamos dos para bailar el tango, ¿no? O sea, por un lado damos más flexibilidad, más competencia, pero por el otro lado queremos dar más cobertura. Entonces, por ejemplo, si voy a hacer una reforma laboral, quiero además tener cobertura de seguro de desempleo, por ejemplo, que nos dé un seguro contra este shock que estamos teniendo ahora. Entonces aquí pueden ver, esa es la idea. Y las políticas de mayor equidad, repensar las transferencias para que lleguen a los sectores vulnerables, y además darle más servicios y de más calidad a los grupos de menores recursos. Bueno, eso es la parte general, y además voy a hacer énfasis muy rápido en opciones de reforma. Acá esto no es que hay que hacerlas todas, sino que cada país tiene que elegir aquellas donde les apriete más el zapato de alguna manera, y me refiero a políticas que bajen el costo de crear empleo productivo, ¿no? Como ustedes saben, la informalidad afecta a 1 de cada 2 trabajadores en América Latina. Entonces acá el tema es cómo eliminar brechas entre empleos formales e informales. Acá podemos pensar políticas de contrato de emergencia para los nuevos contratados. Después bajar los costos de crear empresas y bajar los costos del capital. Otra vez, por tiempo no voy a entrar en detalle, los discutimos después. Y después también pensar políticas sectoriales para mejorar la calidad de la educación, mejorar la calidad de la infraestructura y apuntalar el comercio exterior. Este último punto sí lo voy a resaltar un poco más. Tenemos que aprovechar idealmente oportunidades de nearshoring, aunque nos va a costar esto porque tenemos relativamente baja productividad en la región. Reducir los costos regulatorios de la logística, ¿no? Porque no podemos hacer estas mejoras en un vacío que no genere procesos eficientes para el comercio exterior. Apalancar acuerdos preferenciales con los Estados Unidos y Canadá, y también, sobre todo, expandir la integración intrarregional si queremos que estas cadenas de valor funcionen bien en la región. Entonces, estos son solo ejemplos, pero ojalá que si logramos implementar esta estrategia, cuando miremos 15 años adelante para atrás, en vez de encontrar ese patrón de ausencia de convergencia de la región, nos encontremos con un patrón parecido a este otro, donde sí empecemos efectivamente el catch-up con el resto del mundo. Bueno, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Alejandro. Pasamos a la parte de presentación con Marlon, que va a ser más una conversación. Me interesaba mucho que Marlon nos pudiera contar en el periodo pre-pandemia, ¿no? Como coordinador del área económica, presidente del Banco Central. Si uno mira los números de Honduras, llama la atención que en el 2013 tenían casi 6 puntos de déficit del PBI, ahora antes de la pandemia estaba alrededor de superávit prácticamente. Y esto había hecho con una cosa bastante balanceada de gastos y de impuestos, pero lo más interesante es que este ordenamiento fiscal, si se quiere, no bajó el crecimiento, al contrario, pasó de 0,4 previamente a alrededor de 1,9 en el periodo posterior, y la pobreza medida a 3,2 pasó de 33,5 a 30,6. Entonces, Marlon, tú como coordinador del área económica que logró esto tan especial, si nos pudieras dar tu visión, ¿qué fue lo que hicieron? ¿Cuál es la parte técnica, si se quiere, pero también la parte de política, de de política para haber podido lograr esto.
Gracias, Eugenio. ¿Me escuchan? Sí, ¿verdad?
Sí.
Gracias, Eugenio, por la invitación. Es un privilegio poder compartir contigo y con el resto de colegas en este panel en un tema tan relevante, especialmente en este contexto de la pandemia y en el caso particular de Centroamérica, especialmente en la región del Triángulo Norte, incluyendo Nicaragua, ahora que recién está pasando el huracán y tormenta tropical Eta, que va a tener un impacto adicional a los que ya había mencionado Alejandro en la presentación anterior. En el caso particular de Honduras, como tú bien mencionas, en el año 2013, después del ciclo político y algunas situaciones que se presentaron en ese año, el déficit fiscal de Honduras llegó a casi 7.9% del PIB, si lo vemos en términos tanto del sector público no financiero y de la administración central. Y obviamente eso nos obligaba a tomar decisiones importantes. Y ahí voy a probablemente usar varios de los elementos de la estrategia que propone Alejandro, que en el caso de nosotros funcionaron, yo diría, de manera bastante efectiva, por algunas razones que voy a mencionar ahorita en esta plática. Y yo creo que tal vez el primer mensaje que yo quisiera dar es que debe haber un liderazgo por diseño. Muchas veces el problema de los países es que ante las situaciones de crisis empezamos a reaccionar más que a respirar profundo y a tomar un poco de calma y repensar qué es exactamente lo que queremos hacer. Y en ese sentido creo que el mensaje que nos transmitía Alejandro de aprovechar la estancia en el túnel pandémico para pensar medidas que nos permitan salir adelante una vez que salgamos del túnel, creo que es importante. En el caso de nosotros teníamos un túnel no pandémico en aquel entonces, pero sí con una problemática fiscal bastante grande. Y lo que decidimos fue hacer una reforma fiscal. Para algunos pudiese ser tradicional y obviamente tiene sus lados o sus implicaciones que no necesariamente son del todo positivas, pero decidimos incrementar el IVA en 3% en adición a otras medidas fiscales para poder hacerle frente al desbalance macroeconómico que existía en ese momento, pero con una particularidad, y es que parte del compromiso que nosotros como equipo económico asumimos era que ese 3% de incremento al IVA nos iba a servir para poder financiar programas sociales. Y ahí, en línea con lo que mencionaba también Alejandro, identificamos cuáles eran los sectores que tenían un multiplicador más importante, no solamente para facilitar y seguir atendiendo toda la problemática social, pero también para ir impulsando el crecimiento. Y encontramos 3 sectores que son muy comunes en nuestras regiones y que algunos fueron mencionados en la presentación anterior. Uno es obviamente el sector de infraestructura, y dentro del sector de infraestructura, en el caso particular de Honduras, identificamos que el apoyo a la construcción era un generador de empleo inmediato, tenía un multiplicador arriba de 1 y al mismo tiempo nos permitía atender una necesidad importante que era el déficit de vivienda, especialmente de vivienda social. Y para nosotros este era un elemento importante porque generalmente cuando se produce una crisis económica tan profunda como seguramente va a suceder ahora con la pandemia, en países en que en adición a los temas económicos que son comunes y que todos conocemos, hay otras condiciones como los temas de violencia, que particularmente en el caso de Centroamérica eran muy agudos en ese momento. Entonces tendía a provocar, y así sucedió de manera significativa también, los problemas migratorios, que ese es un elemento que más adelante voy a retomar, pero que no lo podemos descuidar. Y en ese sentido, el hecho de haber utilizado casi 1.2 puntos del PIB para atender las redes de protección social fue fundamental. Y la construcción fue un elemento. El segundo era el sector agrícola. Y el sector agrícola, si bien es cierto, no tenía un multiplicador tan grande, sí tenía un efecto social muy importante, especialmente porque en Honduras hay mucha agricultura de subsistencia y se decidió crear como parte de la reforma fiscal un fondo que se conoce como FIRSA, que tenía como propósito fundamental precisamente apoyar al sector agroalimentario. Y en tercer lugar, seguir fortaleciendo las redes de protección social. Nosotros, con la ayuda del Banco Interamericano, en ese entonces, tal vez tú recuerdas, Eugenio, porque tú eras miembro del board conjuntamente conmigo, nosotros empezamos a desarrollar los programas de transferencias condicionadas, y ahí la clave para mí fueron 3 elementos. El primero es la coordinación entre todos los multilaterales que participamos. En ese sentido, tanto el BID, el Banco Mundial, CABEI, el BESIE, en ese sentido, coordinamos un solo tipo de intervención, lo cual reducía de manera significativa los costos de transacción y al mismo tiempo nos permitía garantizar la continuidad en el programa para que pudiera tener el efecto que nosotros andamos buscando. Ese me parece que es un elemento fundamental de ese componente. El segundo es algo que yo recomiendo de manera significativa, y es a lo que me refiero a liderazgo por diseño, es que todos estos programas tenían un componente importante de medición de impacto. Y esto al final, cuando se está haciendo uso de recursos públicos escasos en un contexto cuando el déficit fiscal es arriba de 7 puntos del PIB, como ustedes comprenderán, es fundamental tratar de hacer el mejor uso de los recursos, y en ese sentido el tema de transparencia y rendición de cuentas resultaba fundamental. Y con la ayuda particularmente del BID de manera inicial, pero después tanto con el Banco Mundial como con el BESIE, el componente de la medición de impacto resultó fundamental precisamente para poder seguir escalando y obteniendo financiamiento de acuerdo a lo que habíamos previsto para el periodo de 4 años que nosotros habíamos establecido nuestro programa económico. Y tercero, yo sé que este es un tema que en algunos países es bastante sensitivo, en el caso de nosotros fue muy importante, fue la negociación de un programa con el Fondo Monetario de largo plazo. Tuvimos un programa de 36 meses, bastante complejo, desde mi perspectiva bastante exitoso, como voy a mencionar más adelante, porque nos permitió varios elementos que son fundamentales. El primero era generar certidumbre en cuanto a la hoja de ruta que nosotros íbamos a seguir precisamente para ir alcanzando la estabilidad macroeconómica. Nosotros definimos internamente la estabilidad macroeconómica como un derecho ciudadano, porque al final, si no, son los más vulnerables los que terminan pagando la factura de una u otra forma. Y yo hago un símil que la estabilidad macroeconómica es como la salud. Pocos la valoramos hasta que no la perdemos, y realmente eso es lo que estábamos nosotros visualizando, y el programa con el fondo venía en esa forma a poderlo hacer. ¿Cuál fue la ventaja de este programa? Y es que este es un programa que nosotros habíamos diseñado en donde el liderazgo y el empoderamiento era de nosotros como autoridades, y el fondo estaba más como acompañamiento. Y en ese sentido definimos que fuera un programa precautorio. La idea de nosotros no era recurrir al Fondo Monetario para poder obtener recursos, sino precisamente que nos sirviera como la carta de presentación para dos situaciones en particular. La primera, para poder accesar recursos, sobre todo concesionales, que es a los que tiene acceso Honduras en los multilaterales, por un lado, pero por el otro lado, en tratar de mandar un mensaje para el sector privado, porque como bien mencionaba Alejandro, la participación del sector privado es fundamental en estos procesos de recuperación. Es difícil que el Estado lo pueda hacer todo, sobre todo cuando las cuentas fiscales no lo permiten. Y en ese sentido, para nosotros, la mejora de la calificación crediticia era una de las metas más importantes, y la reducción del ENVI o del riesgo país. Para ponerlo en contexto, en este periodo de 3 años, nosotros tuvimos 7 upgrades consecutivos en la calificación crediticia, considerándolo no solamente pasamos de B negativa, de perspectiva negativa, a tener ahora W negativo, perspectiva estable. O sea, si nosotros vamos viendo todo ese proceso, y el riesgo país de Honduras pasó de ser 830 basis points, que era a finales del año 2013, a cerca de 200 basis points que terminamos en noviembre de 2017, que fue cuando terminó el programa con el Fondo Monetario. Entonces, eso es una reducción significativa que permitió también al sector privado beneficiarse, porque obviamente al pasar la reforma fiscal, siempre el sector privado, especialmente en países como los nuestros, son los primeros en reaccionar en ese sentido. Y yo creo que al final fue una experiencia exitosa. Y como tú mencionabas, Eugenio, el déficit fiscal, si lo vemos en el sector público no financiero, pasó de casi -8 a -1 a partir del año 2016, anclado con una ley de responsabilidad fiscal que nosotros establecimos. Si ustedes revisan las cifras de Honduras en los últimos 3 años antes de la pandemia, 16, 17, 18, incluso 19, el déficit fiscal del sector público no financiero era menor al 1% y generamos superávit en 3 de esos 4 años, superávit primario. Y eso nos ha permitido mantener estabilidad en el nivel de endeudamiento, que obviamente se ha visto deteriorado con el tema de la pandemia. Y sin olvidar que hay otros elementos que son importantes que no podemos pasar de vista. En ese sentido, yo creo que el tema de crear institucionalidad, especialmente en sectores como el sector agrícola, es fundamental también. Y aquí lo voy a hablar desde la perspectiva de coordinador del Gabinete Económico. Un elemento que para nosotros fue fundamental en la negociación de la utilización de los recursos que se generaban con la reforma fiscal era precisamente el que la contraparte fuera creíble. Y en ese sentido es muy importante que los ministros de Agricultura puedan entender que en la medida que se puedan presentar programas serios, programas enfocados en resultados, en donde prevalezca la profesionalización y la despolitización de los programas, que es un elemento a veces complicado en nuestros países, resulta fundamental. O sea, si nosotros tenemos que decidir conjuntamente con el presidente de la República qué sectores apoyar o no apoyar y las razones por las que se deben o no se deben apoyar, este es un elemento fundamental que muchas veces se deja de lado. Creemos que por tener una buena propuesta técnica termina ahí para convencer el proceso de asignación de los recursos. Y en el sector agrícola, precisamente por la naturaleza propia del sector, este es un elemento que es fundamental. ¿Cómo se logra eso? Y ese es parte del otro mensaje que yo quisiera dar y que esté también vinculado con lo que mencionaba Alejandro. El tema de la eficiencia, de la productividad y del impacto es fundamental. Y nosotros veíamos cómo, por ejemplo, apoyar proyectos de financiamiento de sistemas de riego era fundamental para poder incrementar la productividad del sector agrícola. Eso para nosotros fue muy importante porque fue muy fácil determinar cuál era la línea base y los resultados que esperábamos alcanzar en términos de productividad. Veíamos varios sectores productivos cómo incrementaron, varios cultivos cómo incrementaron sus niveles de productividad precisamente por esta inversión, y eso hacía muchísimo más fácil justificar el retorno que nosotros estábamos obteniendo. Por el otro lado, el tema de investigación y desarrollo resulta fundamental, y ahí creo que los multilaterales y Alejandro, que está en el área de investigación, hablamos en las semanas recientes precisamente del tema de la investigación aplicada, lo fundamental que tiene. Y el tercero es el uso de la tecnología. Cuando hablamos de los procesos de digitalización, yo creo que en el sector agrícola hay un espacio importante para incrementar la productividad mediante la utilización de la tecnología, de diferentes tipos de tecnología. No voy a entrar en el detalle, además de que no soy experto en el tema, pero sí el tema de la utilización de la tecnología para la mejora de la productividad es fundamental. Otro elemento que para nosotros fue importante como parte de este proceso de transformación fue en los temas de financiamiento. Y en los temas de financiamiento, yo quisiera destacar 3 temas que para mí son importantes. El primero es el tipo de instrumento que se utiliza. Por la naturaleza propia de los riesgos asociados con el sector agrícola, muchas veces es difícil el poder obtener financiamiento en términos favorables. Y en ese sentido, la creación de los fondos de garantía ha sido un mecanismo importante para el cual nosotros siempre estuvimos dispuestos a asignar recursos porque veíamos realmente el impacto que podría tener siempre manteniendo las condiciones de mercado y algunos otros elementos que son importantes en el otorgamiento del crédito para el sector productivo, especialmente para el sector agrícola. Y esto me lleva a un segundo punto que está asociado también con el tema de la credibilidad institucional. Y es, lastimosamente, uno de los sectores, probablemente con el sector de transporte, de los que reciben recursos públicos que menos credibilidad tiene es el sector agrícola, precisamente por temas de problemas de moral de pago. Y aquí voy a mencionar en el caso de mi país, había un banco de desarrollo agrícola que siempre había decretos que venían cada vez que se acercaba el ciclo electoral para la condonación de deuda y para el no pago de eso. Eso definitivamente ahuyenta de manera significativa la obtención de financiamiento en términos favorables para el sector agrícola, porque siempre está el riesgo asociado del no pago. Y por eso es que el tema del establecimiento de mecanismos de garantía para que puedan actuar en condiciones de la sequía, por ejemplo, los riesgos asociados precisamente con el negocio puede ayudar, pero no los riesgos asociados con el no pago que de una u otra forma afectan de manera importante la credibilidad del sector. Y el tercer elemento que para nosotros fue importante en este proceso también fue el establecimiento de la garantía de precios. Nosotros, y aquí puedo hablar como porque era presidente del Banco Central, uno de los mayores problemas que tuvimos en el 2014, en adición al crowding out que estaba generando las necesidades de financiamiento del sector público y el incremento de las tasas de interés que se dieron para poder atender esa necesidad, era que se vino una crisis alimentaria, especialmente en el frijol rojo. El frijol es probablemente uno de los, o es el producto más importante dentro de la canasta básica del hondureño común y corriente, y se presentó una escasez precisamente por los bajos niveles de producción, por temas de sequía, y esto generó un incremento significativo en los precios que también promovió la especulación y otro tipo de situaciones. Eso nos provocó que casi el 50% del incremento de la inflación durante el año 2014 viniera precisamente por el tema de la crisis alimentaria. Y a veces esas distorsiones no se perciben de manera anticipada, y ahí es donde vimos nosotros la necesidad.
And that is where we saw the need and the impact that this had on inflation and the impact that this had on the food basket, and the need to create other mechanisms to promote production in the mid and long term, because indeed there are many short-term incentives, but what we were looking for was to guarantee that in addition to financing issues, in addition to technical assistance and technology, there could always be a market mechanism in place. In this case, the price mechanism to guarantee production in a sustainable fashion over time. And this was an element that worked quite well, precisely in order to guarantee that there could also be certain stability in prices, so that prices wouldn't drop once production was on the increase. And that enabled us to create a bean bank, but subsequently this expanded to other basic and important products. And to conclude this first stage, Eugenio, I believe that this was also useful for us.
Diseñar esta estrategia
What was also useful for us was to use the resources of the fiscal reform in order to invest them in the agricultural sector as part of the economic growth strategy, also for development issues, and in very specific terms, in order to limit or minimize the impact on inequality that was the result of the fiscal reform. Despite the fact that it is true that with these elements that I have shared with you, one could think that everything is perfect, in actual fact, it is not perfect. I believe that the issue of accountability, the depolitization of programs, having a mid and long-term vision associated to what Alejandro mentioned in terms of having new social contracts in place that include these types of initiatives, and the participation of the most vulnerable sectors is absolutely fundamental for us. This has helped us enormously in terms of governance. However, when we lose continuity and when we lose hope, it is very difficult for us to move ahead. That's all for now. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Marlon. I'll go back to you later on, Marlon, to talk to us about the pandemic, the reaction by the different fiscal and monetary entities in Honduras, and your perspective looking ahead. especially with your new and important position within the IDB. I don't know if you want to make a comment about what the IDB is doing, but now I'll offer the floor to Carlos and subsequently to Marco to deliver their presentation. And after that, we will come back to the second round of consultations. Thank you, Marco. Carlos, you have the floor, sir.
Intentar compartir pantalla.
Thank you. I'll try to share my screen.
¿Está en la pantalla? ¿Está?
Can you see my presentation on the screen?
Okay.
Yes.
Ponerlo en modo presentación y ya. Okay.
Okay, I'll try to summarize my presentation into 3 chapters. The first one is to briefly share with you the situation prior to the pandemic. After that, the macroeconomic, the most relevant macroeconomic and sectorial impacts, and finally, some of the ways to exit the pandemic, referring to what Alejandro said, the exit out of this tunnel. The first thing that we would have to explain in the case of Chile is that 3 situations come together that have made this period especially difficult. First of all, a very relevant and important social crisis that was expressed very strongly during the last quarter of 2019 and the first part of 2020, and that to a certain extent was interrupted by the appearance of the pandemic. But that social crisis is latent, and probably as a result of what Julio also said to us, there is institutional scope to think, to imagine a new social agreement, and I'll refer to that later on. Secondly, in the case of Chile, what has also been present for the agri-food sector, and very strongly so, is a situation of a long period of drought. And the debate should be whether this is just a specific happening, or rather whether this is the result of a structural change as a result of climate change. And thirdly, the health crisis and its social and economic effects. So I'll go back to the conditions that have enabled an adequate development of the agri-food sector for practically 3 decades. First of all, there are a whole series of macroeconomic conditions. I'm not going to discuss these in depth, but I'd simply like to point out that it's very difficult to imagine the development of an agricultural sector or of an agri-food system in general if it does not have appropriate and favorable macroeconomic conditions. In the case of Chile, I believe that the most significant characteristics of that macroeconomic policy has been rigorous fiscal policy maintained during 3 or more decades that basically meant a balance and respect for the structural surplus rule during a very long period of time. After that, a strict monetary policy that has led to a highly stable inflationary control or control of inflation at a range of around 4%, which is the target range for the central bank for more than 2 decades. After that, an exchange policy, which a floating exchange rate that again has been maintained for decades, and that regardless of its eventual variation, we cannot forget that Chile is a mining country, essentially. It is the biggest producer and exporter in the world of copper and so on, and therefore the exchange rate has had important fluctuations over the past few years, based primarily on what happened during the so-called commodity supercycle, where there was a significant appreciation of the Chilean peso, and that ended up by having an impact on a part of the economy, primarily the agri-food sector. But if one looks at this with a wider horizon, the exchange policy has been favorable for the agricultural and livestock sector. Now, our openness in terms of trade has been a variable that explains to a large extent the positive development of the agri-food sector in Chile. especially because of the early adoption of this strategy. In the case of Chile, our opening to trade, both via doing away tariff barriers unilaterally that have dropped tariffs to 6 years, but also because of the negotiation of multiple free trade agreements, has meant that our real tariffs are at around 1%, in fact, even perhaps a little lower. But the fact that we developed all that early on, many have done that later on, has, I think, provided a significant advantage to the agri-food industry. After that, then, of course, the promotion of investments and equal conditions for foreign and national investors has meant the attraction of investments for the agri-food sector and for also for mining and energy. And also, finally, gradual adjustments to the taxation structure. Over the past decades, that structure has been modified so as to respect the idea that permanent expenditures imply permanent income, and therefore our social policy has been closely linked to these gradual adjustments in the taxation structure. Now, with regards to the agri-food sector, what has happened? Well, basically, we have expanded our sectorial GDP. I can remind you that between 2014 and 2018, the sectorial GDP on average expanded by 2.7% per year, whilst the economy as a whole grew at a rate of 2.2. This was repeated in 2019 and will again be repeated in 2020 at a negative level. The economy will probably drop by around 5%, and the agri-food sector will be between 0 and -1 or -2% max. Then the increase of exports, that has been the main driving force of the agri-food sector in Chile. It has increased threefold over the past 20 years. Productive diversification, the appearance of new species and new lines of or new possibilities for being present in international markets. So the change in the use of the soil involving regional specialization with a better use of natural resources, the employment adjustments, seasonal based employment has increased, and now we can provide labor for 10 out of the 12 months, and the changing contracts has also been important. We subcontract primarily, and there's also been a significant increase in salaries paid to agricultural farmers. And despite the fact that there is an increasing lack of labor force in the agricultural sector associated to other aspects, such as the physical effort involved in working in agriculture during very harsh conditions, especially during the summer. Now, those are all the positive aspects. Now, in terms of debt, undoubtedly, we find problems of rural poverty and low quality of life in rural areas. Regardless of the fact that rural poverty has dropped over the past 15 or 20 years and has dropped by half, the gap that exists between the urban and rural world in this sense is very significant. And I would like to highlight a point that has already been mentioned here, and that is the gap that has become much more evident, of course, over the past few months. The gap that exists in digital connectivity. Chile is perhaps one of the countries in the region that has one of the highest digital coverage in our region. However, in the rural area, household connection is less than 10%, and that undoubtedly is a deficit that has become evident linked to health problems. But imagining a modern development of agriculture in the future, it is fundamental to be able to bridge that gap. Now, just a minute to talk about trade policy. What is relevant here? Well, what is relevant here is that Chilean agriculture is linked to practically 85 or 90% of the world's GDP. And this means that it can gain access in advantageous conditions to the whole developed world, especially to the European Union, the US, Japan, to all the emerging world, especially in the major Asian economies, and especially China. I would like to say that China has become, in 15 years, ever since we signed the free trade agreement with them in 1996, to date, has become the biggest market for Chile's food exports. When we signed the free trade agreement with them, it was practically irrelevant, but today it is the biggest trade partner in terms of food exports from Chile. And then the appearance of new species, new varieties that enabled us to significantly diversify agricultural exports from our country. Now, this is what I mentioned with regards to poverty. This poverty based on income changes a little bit when one analyzes multidimensional poverty. But what I would like to highlight here is that poverty in the rural area, both as a result of incomes and also from a multidimensional level, is practically twice as big as urban poverty. And despite the drop, what this graph shows, we have had a significant drop, but a very important gap, and most probably, and we still don't have data in that sense, the health crisis and its economic and social impacts will probably imply an increase in both urban and rural poverty. Now, what has been the impact of the pandemic on the country's economic condition? Well, first of all, the latest estimations from the central bank means that there has been a drop of 4.5 to 5.5% of the GDP. This is something that is still varying, but it will probably be in that range. Now, with regards to the agri-food industry, there'll be a drop of -2. That is the most negative hypothesis. 0% is the most positive. And we have to also consider climatic conditions and drought rather than simply the pandemic. And I'll refer to that later on. Another pillar for the development of the sector has, as I mentioned, been the exchange policy. We have had during 2020 a 5 to 15% devaluation, depending on when we take when we take that snapshot. If we consider some figures, that devaluation is around 5%, and it will depend on what happens in the US, whether that is maintained, whether it increases or not. But it is worth highlighting that a recent phenomenon has appeared, which is a high level of volatility in exchange rates because of the margins that I'm mentioning here, but volatility in the exchange rate that did not exist in the past. In summary, then, we have maintained a policy of a floating exchange rate, and the level of exchange rates continue to be favorable or very favorable for the agri-food sector, both for that which exports and those that substitute imports. Now, the increase of unemployment, we were prior to the pandemic at a level of around 8%, and we are quite easily now at a level of around 12 or 13% or even more, depending on when we actually measure. The increase of rural and urban poverty, we don't have updated information, but no one doubts that there will be an increase, perhaps not too big based on the support that the state has provided, and we will mention that in later on, but undoubtedly there will be an increase of that type of poverty. Another very relevant point, and Marco probably has more updated information, is the increase of food insecurity levels. Chile was at a level of 3%, 600,000 people. In other words, around 150,000 families with facing the situation, and figures, because according to the FAO, will increase to around 1 million, and 150,000 families is a significant increase. We will have to wait, but in any case, it will increase. I don't know whether at that proportion, but it will definitely increase. The increase of fiscal deficit for this year, it's estimated that we will have a deficit of around 8% or maybe a little bit higher than 8%. The increase of public debt, I have heard the figures that have been mentioned here. Chile will end this year with a public debt of around a third of the GDP, 33%, and is expected to achieve a maximum of 44.6% by 2024. And as from there, the hypothesis is that it will be reduced so that at the end of the decade, it reaches the levels that we had prior to the pandemic. But all that depends on the evolution of the pandemic, on whether we will have a recovery, which is not easy. The deterioration in our risk ranking, this is an important element because it increases the cost of indebtedness. Chile, for many years, had a risk classification of A++. It was reduced to A+, and a few weeks ago, some ranking agencies reduced that to A- with a stable perspective. We'll see what happens in the future. And the last point, and I'd like to mention this because this could be relevant in our debate, is the new risks and positioning that are appearing to the international food market. What was most significant in the past were tariffs. After that, we had technical barriers to trade. And now we're entering a new stage where biosafety becomes most relevant. And there are many examples, shrimps from Ecuador, salmon from Chile, chicken from Brazil, pork meat from Brazil, that in different places of China have been penalized, barred, sanctioned because of the assumption that the packaging carried the COVID-19 virus. So I want to say that in addition to the risk, we find a factor of discretionality in destination markets that can be serious, that may be expanded, and that can be even more severe. Carlos, could we, perhaps we could deal with our outlook for the future during the second part. Yes, the only thing that I would like to say is that recovery with transformation has a question mark because it is easier to state this than it is to actually implement this. And I would like to refer to something that Julio said and something that was discussed yesterday. Julio spoke of the need for a new agreement. I fully agree on that. And the new agreement, in the case of the agri-food sector, should be a new relationship between our sector, the environment, and sustainability, adaptation to climate change, new links between the agri-food sector and health, a new link between the agri-food sector and the social world, where the agri-food sector acts from a productive point of view. And hopefully we'll be able to continue to discuss this during the second part. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carlos. Marco, you have 5 or 7 minutes, and after that we'll move on to the issue of the Q&A.
Adelante, perdón, me había mute. Adelante, Marco.
Gracias.
You have the floor, Marco. Colleagues,
Muy bajito, Marco. Muy bajo. Ahora no, ahora estás bien.
Okay.
Can you hear me? I'd like to ask you whether you can see the presentation. Yes?
So I'm going to be taking advantage of the previous presentation to serve as an umbrella of my own presentation about prioritization of productive investment in agri-food chains with orientation, a macroeconomic and multi-sectorial approach. So what the rest have mentioned is very much aligned to what I've said. I mean, why should we put a priority on the investment on agri-food chains? Now, of course, we are have a different context. Our colleagues have already talked about that, particularly about the fiscal deficit, the crisis that we have on the public spending. Now, it's also important to mention the high risk averse that private investors are. Now, somehow we need to wait or expect for this. So one thing that we are seeing from FAO is the importance of public investment on productive infrastructure, which is related to the agri-food sector. We're talking about roads, irrigation systems, storage systems, etc. Now, of course, we know that agriculture is not the main growth aspect of the region, but we need to focus on where we have potentialities in this particular context. Now, why do we have a macroeconomic and multi-sectorial approach? Of course, we need to invest with a higher fiscal restriction, and it's key to assess the funding options when it comes to public investment. Previous presentations have dealt with the fiscal space, how to create room without necessarily jeopardize the sustainability of the debt, etc. Now, this is an aspect on which we're very clear. And why it should be multi-sectorial? Mostly because we need to think about how we aim at sectors with the potential of productivity, which create employment and income, but mostly related to other sectors of the agri-food system, which are not restricted to. Now, we've been working on computer models. I think that, well, we were hearing about economy with macroeconomic rules. Now, of course, we're using these models, but at a country level with a broad multi-sectorial disaggregation. Now, one of the positive aspects of this is that during crisis, I mean, I've heard Marlo talk about impact measurement, for instance. So this is what we're aiming at from FAO, but we're doing this through the generation of prospective scenarios, which are validated by the economic authorities. So we are getting close to some authorities. I mean, of course, we had a good partnership with the agricultural activities. And so with these authorities, we are creating baseline scenarios to see behavior of the economy at a sectorial group. We project that behavior without changing any policies or external situations. And then we create different scenarios when it comes to public investment. And the idea is that for the same investment amount defined with the authorities, we see how the effects change on a chain-by-chain basis. With the same money, for instance, if we invest on coffee or if we invest on cattle farming, for instance. But on top of that, we are adding to the analysis the significance, the funding way. So at the end of the day, what we are giving governments within this framework of context is a ranking of the most cost-effective productive chains from a social but an economic perspective for economic recovery. I'm just going to share with you some results, for instance, the Nicaragua case. Now, today, this is all framed within the COVID pandemic. So we are aiming at recovery in Mexico and Paraguay as well, and maybe some other countries in the future. Now, very briefly, I think it was Alejandro and Marlo maybe as well mentioned this. And I think that Carlos, in the case of Chile, also mentioned that the prior COVID, the situation wasn't really so bright. In the case of Nicaragua, the analysis wasn't the result of COVID. It was the result of quite a significant crisis we had back in 2018 when the GDP suffered a significant drop. Now, the case of Nicaragua is the most complicated case because then we had the COVID crisis, of course, and that curve changed. But the analysis of the baseline in Nicaragua considered this economic crisis and also its recovery. Now, with the scenario assessment, we developed a base scenario with the authorities from Nicaragua, and we had from 2016 to 2030, you know, how the economy would grow with a business as usual scenario, so to speak. And of course, keeping the tax and the spending policies, without any significant changes, actually, which was essential for the government. And then what we did was to try to understand what would happen if the government started to invest on productive infrastructure in agriculture. So, of course, we have the issue of macroeconomic here, because, well, briefly, I'd like to say that public investment, it's going to have a series of effects. And now this is important to consider going forward, whatever scenario we work on the different countries. So that it's going to increase the stock of capital investment. It's going to have a significant effect on the productive of agriculture. So based on the different sectors that we identify. So it's going to increase production, it's going to reduce the factorial employment of agriculture, but it's also going to increase the capital stock. There's going to be an increase of salaries, for instance, and also it could increase income in different households with significant improvement in private investment and GDP. Now, this sounds great, but depending on the type of investment, that impact that we see at the GDP, it may be different at the end. So we really need from computing experimentation to tell the countries what would be a potential impact at a macro level. So for instance, if this investment were funded by a foreign endowment, there's going to be an inflow of foreign currency and an effect on the actual exchange rate, that it's going to have impact on exports. Probably they are going to go down, and an increase in imports. So that in that case, we have a real impact on the GDP. Now, on the contrary, if we decided to fund investment with internal indebtedness, the impact would be completely different. So here, for instance, we see that there's going to be a displacement on savings that may fund private investment. So there's going to be a reduction of private investment, and probably the GDP is also going to go down. Now, these are results that you need to consider within certain accounting framework. Now, in the case of Nicaragua, we agree with the Ministry of Finance to define a scenario by which public investment in infrastructure would be equivalent to minus 0.5 of the GDP. This was agreed with the government, so we had different results for the government. Just to summarize this a little bit about the results, this is the GDP in the public investment scenarios as a percentage deviation with respect to the base scenario, the baseline that we had. So here what you see are different scenarios, a summary, of course, but because there were many other scenarios for the different chains. So this is agriculture in general with external funding, then agriculture as a whole with an additional 0.5 investment, but with domestic indebtedness, and then the different chains separately. So I like to highlight two things. First, if we fund with domestic indebtedness because of the macroeconomic impact, then you see how investment can be boosted with respect to a scenario with foreign indebtedness, sorry. Now, of course, we share other examples of efficiency, for instance, to the government, and other examples of indebtedness through taxes. And the other thing is that the cattle farming is also seen here, using the same funds that we use for coffee, for instance, and to another chains. This has the greatest impact in terms of growth and productivity, which is very important, because as part of this framework, we need to have a multi-sectorial perspective, right? So cattle farming, in the case of this country, is very much related to the milk industry and the meat industry. And the meat industry specifically is aims at the foreign market. So it doesn't have the restrictions of a more limited domestic market. This is just an example that we had cattle farming as something really important as part of this ranking. Then we discuss debt with the government, and we explain the different scenarios and the different macroeconomic feasibility of the different situations. Now, of course, foreign debt showed the better results with respect to internal indebtedness. So I'm going really fast here because of time. Now, of course, there's some impact on poverty. So here I'm seeing that in the case of cattle farming with foreign indebtedness for investment, there is a significant reduction of poverty, as you can see when you have all that money invested in agriculture. So here in the ranking, we see that there is not so much when indebtedness comes from internal debt. So at the end of the day, this is the results. And what we did was to calculate the net present value of the public investment for the entire period. And what we notice, it's quite interesting because we prepare a ranking of the chains, the productive chains, as you can see on the slide, and we have all the results based on the different annual variations. And the result is interesting. It says that this investment for these given sectors and with this ranking are very cost effective, meaning that they give us profits in terms of well-being, which are higher in comparison to the GDP as respect to investment. So this is the information we provide to them with a multi-sectorial perspective and a macroeconomic perspective as well. So conclusion, the added value of this technical support of the FAO, it's critical to recover and transform the food system. And this is very similar to what was shared by our colleagues, because it's important to consider these scenarios. We need to know whether productive investments in agriculture are an alternative to recover economic, to also reduce poverty, and whether this is going to be key to show governments the path they may take. Now, it's also important to see in which sectors the same amount of money can create better economic and social returns with, of course, the prevailing macroeconomic restrictions. Now, this is important because it helps to know about the public spending, but also it informs the feasibility on how to fund it, because this is not so obvious. And it also gives information to the different countries about technical information, technical data, to have a discussion with international organizations with evidence so as to access to these resources. And also what we are doing is to select the star chains, to study them on depth and work on investment. So what we're doing now in the case of Nicaragua, for instance, is to see in which phases of cattle farming we should invest and in what exactly to invest. In some geographic regions, it may be on grass, in some others going to be in insemination, for instance. So based on that, we are assessing the economic recovery scenario. So once again, these are assessment scenarios of productive chains that are cost effective with a multi-sectorial approach and with keeping macroeconomic aspects in mind, of course. So now let's go to another session. Rodrigo, please, if you could show us the form for questions. And once Rodrigo presents that, and while you fill in the forms, if you are receiving questions, I'm going to give you a few more minutes for Marlo and Carlo to talk about the current situation with pandemic and then after recovery. Thank you, Eugenia. I've just shared through the chat the link to the form so that you can answer the questions. And this link, it's also available in the YouTube channel for all of those who are participating through YouTube so that they can contact us as well. Okay, so the idea is to know what would be the macroeconomic policies to support the agri-food system when it comes to the sustainable objectives, considering also the impact of the pandemic. I mean, in the past was just macroeconomic and the sustainable development goals, exchange rate, commercial aspects, etc. But now we need to add the macroeconomic policies within these 4 dimensions that would be necessary to rebuild, to reconstruct what it's being affected now, and also how we can ensure resilience or how we can strengthen the productive chains considering this pandemic, which was not so clear as part of the SDG when they were created. So that's the question. So while you fill in the form, I would like to give you a few minutes to Marlon. Maybe you could like to talk about the current situation in Honduras, and then Carlos. I mean, the idea is to answer to the same question, the current situation and afterwards.
I don't have a crystal ball, but there are 3 elements that I would like to highlight in that sense. And evidently, the countries that have done their homework from the viewpoint of macroeconomic stability in the past will have the possibility of experiencing a measure of a package of measures to impact the situation, which will be much more solid and consistent, as mentioned by Alejandro in that graph, where he showed the size of fiscal packages based on the level of indebtedness. And I'll speak about the issue of Honduras and Central America, countries such as Costa Rica and El Salvador that suffer a fiscal crisis that was inherited from prior the pandemic, and they will certainly be facing a far more complex situation in comparison to Guatemala and other countries. So the fact that that the homework has been done on time will mean that we will have a far stronger recovery period and a faster recovery period than those countries that have not acted in the same fashion. And that leads me to the second element, which was mentioned by Alejandro in more general terms. This is work that was conducted by the bank, but Marco has also mentioned that, and I sincerely like his approach because it's very similar to the one that we adopted in 2014 in the case of Honduras, analyzing that type of scenario, and that has to do with the quality of expenditure in a scenario where indebtedness levels will be complex and where there is a lot of uncertainty, where the cost of financing, I didn't mention this in the first part, but I would like to mention now, Central American countries devote today between 25 and 30% of their taxation, tax collections simply to pay interests. And to the extent that the macroeconomic situation becomes worse, so the cost of financing will increase to the extent that risk increases in countries. And that will have an additional impact in limiting fiscal scope in order to do this. In consequence of the issue of using any type of instrument in the cost effectiveness evaluation that Marco referred to is a methodology that can work perfectly well, or the issue of impacts in a more wider ranging fashion can also work. I believe that will be fundamental in terms of prioritizing the use of public expenditure, because there will be no fiscal scope for everything. And the third element that I believe is what was insinuated by Alejandro is that the best investment for economic recovery is to invest in health and to try to minimize the impact of the pandemic in the short term, especially whilst until the vaccine arrives. And I have been very critical, and I've had the opportunity of mentioning this to private sectors in the region. I believe that Central America has not done its homework properly, and the Latin American region, nor has the Latin American region, as you mentioned at the beginning, most of the countries that have been impacted by the pandemic are in this region, and Central America is not the exception. And in that sense, the fact that we have acted late, the fact that we have not invested in prevention will probably cost us in the future, because confinement has led to a severe deterioration in the economic performance of countries. And we see that on average, most countries are facing fiscal deficits, some close to double digits, and the increase of economic growth is quite accelerated in most countries, with the exception of Guatemala. And I believe that will have an important impact. And so to continue to prioritize resources to focus on the issue of the pandemic is part of the stabilization process that will facilitate recovery, in addition, of course, to macroeconomic aspects. So I believe that it is important, and here I would very quickly like to say that in the IDB, indeed, what we want is to channel more technical assistance funds to countries so that we may think and plan the type of interventions that are needed and try to help with the financing of those interventions. I understand that Juan Pablo yesterday held a meeting here in the forum, and there the idea is to obtain resources to supplement the initiatives that will enable the development of the agricultural sector as part of the mitigation initiatives vis-a-vis climate change or the issues of adaptation. I believe that those are spheres where we hope to play a very important role. Thank you. Thank you, Marlon. Rodrigo, you have the list of people participating in the consultation. I have the name but I don't know if it's everyone's name. Mónica Rodríguez, Karina Casella, Paolo Elisalvo. I'd like to give you all the possibility not only of filling in the form, but if you want to make a comment, please let Rodrigo know, and so that you can then participate in these presentations. I'd like to offer the floor to Carlos to review the situation in Chile and some future prospects. I'll do this very summarized manner. In view of time, I'd like to say, first of all, that the crisis is not over. We are in the midst of a crisis, and if one looks at what is happening in the rest of the world, it is highly probable that in the next 4 or 5 months we will face a situation that it will again be very severe. And secondly, something that has also been said here and that I would like to highlight is the close link between health and economic recovery. But before that, there is also a close link between access to food and health. And in consequence, it is very difficult to imagine that we will have some type of control in terms of the evolution of the pandemic if we don't ensure access to food. And access to food in these conditions of crisis implies basically income. We have not had a supply shock practically in no country in Latin America. But we can have a demand shock. In the case of Chile, that hasn't existed because of a whole set of supports, as from the public sector, that represent around 5 and 6% of the GDP, financed via indebtedness, via debt, and via the use of sovereign funds that have been available, and via the reallocation of the budget. But this is not infinite, and therefore we have to be extremely careful in terms of maintaining the situation of the pandemic under control. Otherwise, it will be impossible to imagine an economic recovery. Now, in terms of how to face up to what comes in the future, and Marco said something and Alejandro said something in this sense, I'd like to repeat something when at the end of the first, that I mentioned at the end of the first part. I believe it is necessary to establish a new agenda with new objectives, with new policies, with new instruments. In which areas? Well, in the area of agri-food area, sustainability and climate change, in the area of agri-food systems and health, and in the area of relationship between agri-food systems and the rural world. Now, with regards investments, and this was also mentioned by Marco, and I'm fully in agreement with this, I believe that indeed we have to prioritize investments that have an impact upon productivity. In the case of Chile, irrigation is probably the most significant investment that we have to make, but we also must invest, make public investment in public goods. And when I talk about public goods, I talk about health, food safety, biosafety, the operation of local markets and supply chains in reasonable conditions. And what I also believe is very important is to face up to a technological revolution that is underway. And this implies the adoption and creation of technology. I believe that these are key aspects for the future of the development of the sector. The final thing that I would like to mention, and this is implicit in many of our conversations, but I believe that we could make this explicit, is that we need to think of new engines for the development of the rural world, in the agro-rural world. I have remembered this for many, many years, having worked with Eugenio when we spoke of non-agricultural rural activities. Well, many decades have passed since we conducted that work together. And the truth of the matter is that experience in Latin America continues to be very poor in that sense. I believe that in this sense, we still need work, we still need research. We need to research the few positive experiences that exist in terms of the development of non-agricultural rural activities. What conditions made that possible, to determine whether, as from there, we can formulate policies and instruments. But I would simply like to say that it's very very difficult to imagine a rural world without hunger and without poverty if the only or practically the exclusive engine for development continues to be agriculture, however sophisticated, modern, and dynamic it may be. So I hope that those are the roads that we should venture along. Now, how is this financed? Well, that is a key question, and it will depend on each country. Some will be able to do that via direct debt. Others will be able to do that via the financing of multilateral banks. But indeed, we face a scenario where we face two major restrictions. Restrictions as a result of climate change and restrictions as a result of the fiscal poverty that that all our countries will face in the near future. This leads to cooperation, political willingness, and efficiency in expenditure, as has been repeated over and over again here. Thank you.
I would like to give the floor to my colleagues that are in the area of consults, Paolo or Karina, and I also have a request from Marco to make a comment. So I don't know, Karina or Paolo, if you'd like to make a comment.
¿Están ahí?
Hola Eugenio, ¿cómo estás? Karina, de
Karina,
Argentina.
mucho gusto. Karina es la directora del Centro de
Are you there? Karina, Social Economics Policies.
Adelante, por favor.
¿Qué tal? Un gusto saludar
It's a pleasure.
a los analistas y los expositores. Muy interesantes sus presentaciones. Tardé un poco en responder porque no sé si Paolo iba a tomar primero la palabra, pero estaba acá atenta escuchándolos.
So I took a while to answer because I didn't know whether Paolo was going to speak or not. I really like this debate because, of course, we have this pandemic,
Algunas políticas
and we have these ideas about the role of the agri-food system. So I think it's very interesting to discuss about this. Now, the doubt that I have
desde acá es un poco la palabra esta de reorientar el gasto, en realidad, porque
this is the reality now, because we're going to have a push between important sectors, because this is a general crisis. So it's going to be very important to have instruments to prioritize the different sectors, but
vemos el primer impacto en algunos sectores ahora y muy fuerte, pero aparecen otros sectores como marcaba Alejandro al inicio, por ejemplo el de educación, que recién estamos viendo estos efectos negativos.
The midterm, we are not observing the impact of COVID or the impact of quarantines and pandemics at this present moment. And therefore, there will be a reallocation of expenditure. What can we do then vis-a-vis limited resources, limited fiscal tools to operate within the agri-food sector, considering all these demands that have been shown? If as a result of greater competitiveness in the sector or opening up to foreign trade, whether that is enough or not for countries in the region. That is a lingering question in my mind when we think of the medium term. I don't think it's so easy as to think that via foreign trade, countries in the region will find a solution. So that is a question that I would like to pose to the panel. Thank you, Karina and Paolo. Do you want to discuss the prospects of macroeconomic policies? Very briefly. Thank you very much, everyone. The discussion has been tremendously interesting. And I would like to go back to what we were discussing yesterday when it came to the realignment of public expenditure and the issue of feasibility in political terms in many of the countries. in terms of the political economics of different countries. Often we have discussed about the alignment of fiscal expenditure in agriculture, and it is often much more complex than what can be defined in terms of analytical studies that we conduct today. And obviously the Vice President Marlon, who is present in this panel, will probably be much more aware of what I am talking about.
So I also wanted to say that in many occasions there is something that our analysis sound like post-pandemic, and unfortunately I've been one of the sinners, so to speak, who have thought that pandemic could have been solved in a shorter period of time than reality is showing. And from a financial perspective, or some countries which are more advanced, so to speak, than those in Latin America, they need to consider this. For instance, Europe has made a great effort during the European summer. I mean, they thought it was something, the pandemic was more or less under control, but now if we see the effects are terrible on the economies of Europe. So yeah, I think that this is something that we should consider even further here in Latin America, because this may last for several more months. So I fully agree with everything that it's been discussed in terms of analyzing the effectiveness of the public spending in terms of the investments and the impact assessment that need to be very strict when it comes to specific programs. And also based on yesterday panel, in the case of the IDB, we try to support these type of initiatives so that they are at a macro level, but also we need to have a low public effect when it comes to specific programs. Thank you. Thank you, Paolo. Now, Marco wanted to make a comment also, and Alejandro, Marlon, of course, and Carlos, whenever you like, you can ask for the floor. One comment is just in terms of priorities, we have instruments to do that, to work on prioritization. We have the general criteria models to prioritize based on channels. We also have the instrument that it's also now being used at the FAO to prioritize based on regions, which is something completely different. And also we have another mechanism, which is the one developed by Schengen Hall, the former director of the Big Three, which is how to prioritize based on sectors, for instance, irrigation or science and technology, or social support programs, and the impact of each of them. So there are instruments for prioritization, and it's important to use them. The second comment, very briefly, is Karina and several of our colleagues talked about the problems going forward. And it seems to me that Alejandro talked about other programs. So on top of the deterioration of the human capital because of education, there's also going to be a nutrition problem because the diets have reduced the level of energy, but there's also been a deterioration on the composition of the diets using the 3 diets used by Sophie, and Mark is responsible for one of the main publications from FAO. So we can see there the impact on nutrition. So we all know that nutrition has an impact on cognitive development and also has an impact, a more direct impact on the resistance capacity for the virus. And I also have a question. Carlos mentioned, and Marlon also mentioned, that the agricultural sector has better within this year, the 2020. Now, simulations that we are running at the IGPRIC says that the industries and the services have been affected the most. But if we think about 2021, we are considering some assumptions, but I'd like to hear your ideas, because it seems that in 2021 we're going to have a stronger effect on the agricultural sector, which had the productive capacity of 2019 that is materialized in 2020. But because of the strike we suffered this year, maybe the impact, unfortunately, if this projection is true, would felt in 2021. So I would like for my colleagues to make a comment on this, but I would like to start with Marco. Thank you, Eugenio. I would like to say two specific things. One, just to add on what you were saying about the instruments. The instruments are there, but I think that an important element is how we make them part of this whole thing, the program. Because in the case of Nicaragua, after we did the macroeconomic analysis and the multi-sectorial analysis on the cattle farming, for instance, now we are doing a different analysis, a more comprehensive analysis to identify in Nicaragua what are the hot spots with potential in productive potential. So we need to think about the instruments, but also we need to think about how to integrate them. Now, another important aspect related to your question is what are the policy instruments we should consider. In the presentations I heard from yesterday, we talked about incentives for agriculture, and I think that even though this is a political aspect, it's also important for us to think about that, because the composition of public spending cannot be considered in isolation. We need to think about the advantages and disadvantages of price distortion. For instance, the fiscal cost of this price distortion. And also we need to compare this price distortion with the different scenarios where we can actually allocate this spending that can relate to an investment spending. So I think that the incentives to the agricultural sector need to be a part of this discussion of the micro policies, so as to work on recovery. I mean, the allocation of incentives may be a very strong political incentive to talk about recovery. Thank you, Marco. Now, I would like to maintain this question open. I mean, the perspective for the agricultural sector for 2021. Marlo talked about beans, for instance. So we're doing specific studies about the situation of the bean chain of production in Central America to be prepared in the event there are some difficulties during 2021. Now, I would like to give the floor to Alejandro and then perhaps Karina and Carlos, because they work closer with the agricultural sector. So I would like to hear their opinion about the situation in 2021. So Alejandro, would you like to say something about this? Yes, I wanted to answer Karina's question. We talk easily about allocating resources, but behind this, there are pressure from different sectors. Now, I think the basic aspect here is that we need to be intelligent when reallocating resources. For instance, at first, it wasn't necessary to keep on focusing on public investment or public purchasing, but it was really important to tackle this issue of preservation. So in that case, there was a decision that tends to be easy because reducing public investment doesn't really have a counterparty, so to speak. Nobody complains about this directly. So that's the phase in which we work on, and it was relatively easy. Now we are facing the most difficult part, which is to see the other side of all the spending on transfer, for instance, or to overcome the crisis, everything that we did with the families, the household to face the pandemic. So we need to think about policies that can be temporary. So I'm afraid that, for instance, many of these transfers that were very obvious at the time of the pandemic, now there's some social pressure to maintain these measures, and they are not really that necessary. There are several examples. For instance, in the case of Brazil, the transfer policy was very successful, but now the government has a lot of problems to mitigate them, to reduce them, because they are no longer necessary. So I think that it's also important. And Marlo actually raised the issue of institutionality. So I think that in this region it's important to have agencies of quality to allocate spending. I mean, the governments in generally don't really work a lot on decisions about where should I spend my resources. So we are pushing for creating quality units on spending to have some sort of control, first by assessing the effectiveness and efficiency of the spending that it's allocated, but also then to work on reallocation. So it's important for these units to have authority and to work with the Ministry of Finance so they have a smart way to reassign resources so that they can also explain people how these allocations are going to be taking place. So I think that at some point
aparece en muchos casos en el
do we need to work on the efficiency of spending. So in the public sector particularly, there is a low rating, so they pay up to 30% more when it comes to public salary in comparison to the private sector. So that's an area that we need to work on. But this doesn't imply that we need to reduce the salary for people immediately. Maybe we can think about other reforms by which the new public employers do have a salary policy that it's related to their counterparts in the private sector. So there are some issues, aspects that are going to make a lot of noise when it comes to distributed bids, but I think that the region needs to talk about this and find the answers because resources are going to be scarce. Thank you. Carlos, well, I would like to know, Rodrigo, are there other questions that have you received through YouTube? If that's the case, please let us know. And I would also like to offer the floor to Marlon and Carlos and Karina to hear their opinion about the situation. I mean, Marlon, I would like to hear about your opinion on the IDB perspective going forward. In the case of Carlos, what do you think about the possibility for having the agricultural sector that it's not been so affected? I mean, do you think whether they are going to have more problems next year or no? So Marlo, if you could please take the floor, and then Rodrigo, maybe you can tell us about about the questions in YouTube. I think that it's really interesting this. I would like to touch upon very briefly about the question posed by Karina, and also related to what Alejandro was saying. And Paolo, I think, was talking about this as well. When I talked about Alejandro's ideas, and I think Carlos also talked about this idea of rethinking the new social contract. And the idea of this is that the only way from a political perspective, and we know about this, we need to create consensus so as to really be able to make changes. And in that case, I'm very much concerned, particularly in Central America, is that we are coming close to elections. And of course, this makes the situation a little bit more complicated. Now, of course, we need to consider that there is a high polarization level, as explained by Carlos in the case of Chile. And that's not only being, it's not exclusive for Chile. This also is happening in Honduras, or happened in Honduras after 2017. We are also seeing the same situation. And Marco mentioned this, the fall of GDP in Nicaragua, which was also the result of a political aspect. We are seeing the same in El Salvador. So I think that a key element to rethink the public spending in an efficient way is to make this being part of a broader discussion within the society. We need to rethink the contract, the social contract. We need to be clear on what the priorities are. Because as Alejandro was saying, resources are going to continue to be more limited. There are going to be pressures from all different sectors, particularly now that we have elections coming everywhere. So I think that in that regard, it's going to be really important to reach consensus. Now, I need to leave, by the way, because I have a board meeting now, and we're going to be talking about the action plan related to the climate change in productive area. So in alignment to what Alejandro was saying, most of the vision of the new IDB is how to help countries in two different action areas. One, management of debt, given the conditions that we've all discussed today, but on the other hand, how to improve the spending quality, to try to use different tools, try to play a broker role so as to foster dialogue, to allow countries to move forward with the reform in a more organized way with the participation of all players. So I think that that's going to be key. So in that regard, I think that this opens the door to continue with a further dialogue about this. So thank you again for the invitation to participate in this event.
Directorio, así que Marlon, si necesitas retirarte sin...
Marlon, if you need to leave, simply press the leave button. And certainly, thank you very much for your participation. Karina and Carlos, and then Rodrigo can say to us if we have anything in YouTube. A couple of comments, but I'd like to begin, Eugenio, with the question. How do we feel that the agricultural and livestock sector could fare with the evidence that you have from these models? In Argentina, the agricultural and livestock sector will suffer a more severe impact next year. I think it has so far been resilient. It produces food. It's a market that continued to be active. However, I believe that next year the situation will be worse than this year, and for a whole series of reasons. And some were mentioned by Carlos. Environmental aspects in Argentina, at least, we have suffered a very severe drought this year, and we will certainly evidence an impact next year. In addition to the COVID crisis aspects, that will be important. In 2008, something happened in Argentina, and whenever we face these extreme events, this impacts our GDP heavily. And an additional aspect will be the impact of the present crisis. And this will be the result of what we are discussing here. Something that Paolo mentioned, the political economics. The effective allocation of resources from one sector to the other, because these programs for permanent support that become permanent has distorted the prices, and this begins to become noticeable in the sector. We also have evidence that when prices began to improve over the past few years, this had an impact upon environmental aspects. I think in Argentina, one is aware of all these characteristics. The excess of soybean in some places with more fragile soils. So this had a very severe environmental impact, especially in northern Argentina. And there were many policies that tried to revert those impacts. But the truth of the matter is that gradually, with a change in relative prices, they began to improve rotation and stopped growing soybean in more fragile soils. So I believe that this will imply also an indirect impact in terms of prices. We haven't evidenced that this year, but we will evidence it next year. And I believe that there is an additional aspect there that refers to some of the consequences that we don't have a solution to, and these are of a political type. How each province in Argentina has adapted itself in order to face up to the crisis, and as Paolo says, and I am in the group that I thought was going to be shorter, that we were not going to have such a long lasting quarantines, but this has generated something that we in Argentina have, which is legal provincial borders have become real national borders, and this has distorted trade, especially in logistical terms. And this is a problem that we have now, and that can become even more severe next year, and that is impacting the productive sector. A lot of what was temporary work, people that moved from provinces in the north to the south, and I'll talk about agricultural and livestock issues, but the labor force for certain areas, of our country during harvest are being impacted in terms of logistical terms because of the mobility limitations for people between provinces, and it's also being impacted in terms of these types of problems and the support that will be shorter term. So the sector is readjusting itself, in addition to other aspects, of course. But I feel I coincide with you that next year we may indeed evidence a more severe impact. Thank you very much, Carlos. And after that, Rodrigo, to tell us what is happening with YouTube. I think we have the possibility, given the fact that we had an interruption, to add an additional 10 minutes. So Alejandro Izquierdo, I think, also has a meeting at the IDB, so he has also had to abandon us. But Carlos first, then Rodrigo with YouTube, and then Paolo. And after that, perhaps we would bring this transmission to an end. Okay. I believe that the basic question is, what are the questions or the aspects that would enable the agri-food sector to maintain a relative normality during the next season? And for that purpose, we need to question, well, what is it that made that possible during 2020? And regardless of the fact that there may always be climatic variables that impact impact production, I believe that basically we're talking here of maintaining with relative normality the operation of the input supply chain, the chain that has to do with financing, short-term financing for operational purposes, and the possibility that markets, local, provincial, and national markets, also operate and work in an adequate fashion in view of the new situation created by the pandemic. I believe that those are three major factors. And the other element that we must take into consideration, and that has worked properly to date, but we don't know what will happen next year, is demand. If demand maintains a relative stability because the economic situation becomes much more stable, or because there is state support that enables access to food. At least in the case of Chile, I would not anticipate a situation which is very different to the one that we have faced this year. However, the climatic variable here will be extremely important, and then the behavior of the pandemic over the next few months. If we go back to a situation similar to what we faced in last April and May, indeed, conditions may have an impact upon the sector, especially in terms of demand restrictions. Now, here, what has been mentioned over and over again, and I agree with that, is the need to supervise expense efficiency, to assess it better, and thus to provide elements for the reallocation of public expenditure. I believe that that is indeed a very important dimension where we invest public resources that will be much scarcer than in the past. But I would also dare mention another dimension of this discussion that I feel is inevitable, and certainly it will be present in the case of Chile over the next few months. And that is the adjustment of the tax burden, because we not only it's not only enough to reduce and adjust expenses, but our economies subjected to tremendous fiscal stress and need more fiscal revenues in order to uphold and sustain social policies, to sustain social redistribution, and to bridge inequality gaps that we know will become much more severe as a result of the pandemic. And here we have to take into consideration several elements. Indeed, we have to take into consideration how we close the windows that enable tax evasion, how we close the windows that enable tax elusion, and how we generate taxation systems that are much more progressive in nature. In the case of Chile, fiscal revenues, even today, half of the fiscal revenues taxation revenues come from VAT, and that is tremendously regressive, and therefore we must advance towards more progressive systems. I know that this is unpopular, and that this involves problems, because within a reality where we need economic development, it doesn't seem to be very advisable to increase the tax burden. But this is an inevitable discussion. I believe that we can discuss this in terms of progressiveness and in terms of a gradual increase of this. But the discussion only around the efficiency of public expenditure without taking into consideration the expansion of fiscal resources is incomplete. It's just a partial discussion. Thank you very much, Carlos. Rodrigo? Rodrigo, there will probably be many comments in YouTube. Yes, I am trying to share my screen. I can say that we have several comments, some with regards fiscal policy, the establishment of mechanisms to recover expenditure that will enable us to project stability and development in the midterm. In other words, to recover that which has been spent. We also have support programs for poor sectors with working capital financing to strengthen the structure of public financing, public expenditure, to assess government's expenditure policies, to establish employment support programs in order to recover the consumption capability of those that have been most harshly impacted. In terms of the exchange rate, there is the idea of implementing stabilization funds for exchange rates, especially aimed at the availability of food. In terms of trade policy, we have incentives for the import of key inputs for production, for example, machinery and fertilizers, doing away with tariffs for food and associated technology, the disappearance of tariffs for tariff barriers for food, and other policy ideas to the need to cater for state demands and the demands of local markets, the different policies by different states to favor agricultural and livestock systems that recover traditional thinking, moving away from the agro-industrial thinking, and to have also temporary taxation in place. That is what we have received. Thank you very much, Rodrigo. We will recover all the information that we are receiving via YouTube, what was obtained during this consultation, and that will form part of tomorrow's closing session above all, and will indeed be included in the final document. I would like to finally offer the floor, before I say my final remarks, to Paolo and Marco, and we have 2 or 3 minutes left. And I think that Alejandro Izquierdo, Karina Casellas, and Carlos Furche also have other commitments, other meetings to attend. So Paolo, first of all, you, then Marco, and after that we conclude. Thank you, Eugenio. I would like to go back to what was expressed by Carlos, and clearly that goes beyond the discussion of agricultural policies, and I refer to the issue of improving the quality of expenditure and finding new ways to improve taxation revenues. That is clearly not my expertise, but I believe that that is a very interesting issue, especially during a period of crisis such as the one that we're experiencing. And I link this with the discussion on political economics that was mentioned by Karina. Obviously, some of these policies are not popular, but during crisis periods, these can be implemented explained in a better fashion to our populations and reach a consensus in a more participative fashion, especially connected to what was mentioned beforehand in terms of transparency and the assessment of public expenditure. There is a very strong argument in place in terms of saying, well, I have to collect some additional resources in order to funnel them towards these problems. And clearly the expenditure that I will have, it will have an effect, and I can show this in a scientific measure that can be disseminated among the public. That is something that will be important in the agricultural sector, and I believe that we can use that in order to aim the discussion towards sustainability and the cost that may be paid in mitigating climate change, and have a more sustainable, productive systems in place for the agricultural sectors in our countries. I believe that that is something that we are discussing in the IDB, as was explained by Marlon, who has had to leave to precisely take part in a discussion of those issues. I believe that that closes, very coherently closes the circle of what we have been discussing. Thank you very much, Pablo. Marco, and after Marco, I will express my final remarks. Marco, you can close your final remarks. Well, this is just a reflection for those. We also always speak about the migration from rural areas to urban areas. And I agree with that, but I would like to add an element that will be a key factor for many countries. Costa Rica, over the past 30 years, and I talk about Costa Rica because I am from there, they saw a widening gap between urban and rural poverty. And Carlos also referred to that in the case of Chile. The last household survey of June 2020 showed two things. First of all, that poverty is increasing now, but now urban poverty is greater than rural poverty. Now, what does that mean? And this is something that has to be taken into consideration by many countries in the region, that if we see this process of migration from the rural areas to urban areas, now it's vice versa, and that will create a whole series of opportunities for agriculture, but also challenges. And I believe that public policies must take into consideration that context, which is different in history. This is a parameter that reverts itself, and that will be a key factor for 2021. That is my comment. Thank you very much, Marco. So, I believe that with this, we would bring this panel to an end in 10 or 15 minutes. We will have the next panel. For all those that are listening to us via different means tomorrow, we will be holding the conclusion of the different panel discussions. There are 8 simultaneous panels operating. Thank you very much for all your comments, suggestions. They have all been registered. There are people that are taking notes of everything that has been discussed. Other people are collecting the contributions and the opinions that we are receiving via different means. And so all that will be inputs for the presentation that I will deliver tomorrow with regards to macro aspects. And as I said beforehand, a more general document on macroeconomics in the agricultural and livestock sector within the context of the pandemic and recovery. Hopefully soon. So I thank everyone that has participated, especially panelists and the people that participated with their questions, and all those that have visited us via different means. Thank you very much, and may you all have a very nice day. Thank you very much, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, goodbye.